We have a basic understanding of where the progression of respiratory systems have come from over the course of evolutionary history and through different organisms. Let's take a step into the mammalian respiratory system and kind of focus ourselves here because this is what's going on in our body. And the main function of this respiratory system is to maintain that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange because you really do need it for all of your overall metabolic processes, at least the ones that require energy derivation. So really we're talking for the most part cellular respiration. And if we look at the purpose or processes, I should say, that accomplish that purpose, we can really sort of break it down into 5 processes. Your actual pulmonary ventilation, which is the air exchange between, or I should say, bringing in the air into your lungs, the actual external respiration, so the gas exchange that's going on between your lung tissue and your blood. Once that exchange has happened and now you've got the blood in your cardiovascular system, we're going to transport that around your body to the cells that actually need it. That's where the internal respiration happens, so that actual gas exchange connection between the blood and your cells, and then finally the actual cellular respiration process that takes place in your mitochondria itself. So when we look at your mammalian systems, really 3 big events are occurring. The ventilation itself, where we're taking the air into your lungs and actually getting that gas, whether we're talking CO2 or carbon dioxide, and getting that gas to reach the alveoli. All right, so that's the ventilation piece. Diffusion of the gas exchange occurring over your simple squamous epithelials, so really, really small, thin, flat tissue cells that, remember, diffusion isn't really very efficient over big distances, so we're going to try to mitigate and make that distance as small as possible to increase the efficiency of that gas exchange. And then what we talk about is perfusion, or the blood actually reaching the alveoli so that that gas exchange can occur from the air that's now in your lungs, and have that exchange occur into the blood itself so that the blood can then flow and take it to the rest of the body tissues. There's also some other important features that are going on in your respiratory system that help organisms above and beyond just that really vital exchange with their environment. So first and foremost, the respiratory system is going to help filter and warm and humidify the air, which is going to help that function of gas exchange be more efficient. In a lot of organisms, it also plays a role in sound vocalization. That's how I'm able to stand here and talk to you today. It's how other organisms communicate. All right, and so that's all about moving that air across those vocal cords, and that's part of your respiratory system in order to manage that. You will have parts of your respiratory system that play a role in defense. This is one of the first big entrances into most organisms' bodies. So we want to be able to mitigate infections. So things like your tonsils, your cilia, just mucus production. You've got macrophages that sit in your alveoli themselves, mechanisms of coughing and sneezing to get things out. All of that is part of this respiratory process, but its job really is there to help to ensure that things like viruses and bacteria don't get into your body. And if they do, how do we get them out? How do we take care of them? You've got the sense of smell, so the olfaction that is also part of your respiratory system. Once again, just kind of another sense, a way for your body to understand the world around them. Survival mechanism, right? Things don't smell right, you don't eat them, that kind of stuff. And then the actual removal, modification, activation, and inactivation of other substances that are part of your pulmonary circulation. There's also a big connection to pH balance. So when we look at the pH of your blood, it's going to get connected back to your respiratory system. Because when we look at, as we get deeper into this, that carbon dioxide that is being produced by your mitochondria as a byproduct of that cellular respiration isn't, for the most part, really carried by any sort of um, cell in your circulatory system. So red blood cells, their major job is to have hemoglobin. The hemoglobin attaches the oxygen, and that's how the oxygen gets transported. But the carbon dioxide's a gas. We got to get rid of it. But pumping your blood system full of gas bubbles is dangerous. That's not what's supposed to be there. So your body will actually take that carbon dioxide and convert it into a compound that it can easily transport that is not in a gaseous form. We get it to your respiratory system, they'll reverse the process so that you can breathe the carbon dioxide out. And what that carbon dioxide actually gets turned into is this compound called carbonic acid. It's the same stuff we see in things like your sodas, right? It's carbonic acid. Once you pop it open, it naturally bubbles out as CO2. But if I'm putting all of this carbonic acid into your blood because you're breathing and you're making ATP, and so you're making carbon dioxide as a byproduct, that's naturally going to end up lowering your blood pH, and that's not a good thing, right? We need that blood pH to maintain a sort of steady condition. So if I don't do that, I can end up denaturing proteins and all sorts of havoc gets wreaked as a result. So your body has a buffer system in place. So your body will produce that carbonic acid as a result of natural metabolic processes, but then it also produces this bicarbonate molecule to help keep your blood pH at a steady level regardless of your demands on your metabolic rate. And that does then translate back to your respiratory system. And so when we look at a overall situation where your body is actually increasing these H pluses, right? So you're producing all of this carbonic acid, body's trying to compensate. You've got excess H plus hanging around in your blood as a result of the system. And so what ends up happening, you end up in this medical state of what we would call respiratory acidosis. Your blood is becoming too acidic. And the bicarbonate system can only do so much, so your breathing takes over as a secondary buffer system. So what ends up happening is that your respiratory rate actually shallows. We're actually going to hamper that gas exchange, and it's usually because of some sort of disease. So something like pneumonia, cystic fibrosis, emphysema, where they've got sort of excess fluid floating around in their lungs and they're not able to exchange those gases with their environment as well as they should. So what ends up happening when your body ends up in this acidotic state is that will actually cause you to take deeper and more rapid breaths as a way to try and expel this excess carbon dioxide, because you're getting this excess H plus from that bicarbonate system breaking down. All right, the more you can breathe out the CO2, the more you remove overall that carbonic acid, and so we can get a leveling out of that H plus concentration. Now, the opposite can also happen. So if you're overbreathing, you're hyperventilating, all right, you're not actually efficiently exchanging gases with your environment, you could actually push your body into respiratory alkalosis. Alkalines are bases, so now I'm decreasing my H plus, my pH is going up. And so in a way for your body to try and compensate via a negative feedback loop is to, rather than make you continue to breathe faster, now we want to slow the system back down. So forcing your body to take slower, more shallow breaths actually holds in the carbon dioxide, which is in the form of carbonic acid at the time, and that's going to help to increase that H plus concentration and hopefully level you back out. So this is just one of those really interesting feedback mechanisms that your body plays as a way to keep you at homeostasis. Now, if we look at the overall organization of the system in humans, right? This, if I took you and sort of cut you belly to back, right, and looked down on you, this is what you would end up seeing. So you've got your lungs that occupy your thoracic cavity, so that top cavity of your body, and everything there is in that cavity with the exception of this mediastinum, all right, which is this piece here, all right, sort of its own pericardial cavity. So you've got your pleural cavities that sit there, mediastinum, which includes your heart and your spinal cord. And then if we dig in and look at the lungs themselves, there are actual differences between your right and left lungs. So if I look at something like the number of lobes, all right, there are actual pieces to that, and you can see them here. So your right lung has 3. You've got your superior, your middle, and your inferior lobes. And then on the left side, this is sort of where the crook of your heart sits. So it's a little smaller as a result, to accommodate for that heart organ. And you've only got 2 lobes on this side. And then we can also break it down into the number of bronchopulmonary circuits. And once again, this is sort of like what I was talking about with the circulatory system. I'm going to kind of throw some information at you. It's kind of cool, kind of interesting. Pick up whatever you can, because I know a lot of kids walk into this class thinking that something medical might be of interest to them. So I want to just kind of expose you. But this isn't necessarily test material. But if you look, you've got all of these branches. All right, so 10 branches on each side, and they've got names, and they're going to feed certain parts of your lungs as they move down that hierarchy of structure. For us, the big part that we're looking at, though, really is the gas exchange piece. So what we're going to focus more on in terms of test material is that as we look at these systems of branching ducts, where do they ultimately end up, and where does the gas exchange actually happen? So when we look in terms of breathing, the whole system is a bunch of branched ductwork. And its job is to get the air from the outside in your environment into your lungs. So how do we get there? Well, you've got a lot of these branching tubes. So if I look, you've got things like your pharynx and your larynx up here in your head. So the pharynx's job is to direct air and to the lungs, and then food to your stomach. So we're not quite there yet, but this is where you're swallowing. This is kind of at the back of your throat. And then the swallowing tips your epiglottis. So when you actually make a swallowing motion with the muscles, as your body learns to do this, and actually you learn to do this in utero, by the way, you kind of just end up working on swallowing a bunch of amniotic fluid. That swallowing mechanism will allow your epiglottis, which sits here over your larynx, to close. All right, and that glottis will slap closed, preventing food from going into your trachea. And any of you have ever sort of choked on something, that mechanism didn't quite do what it was supposed to, and you can kind of feel like that stuff is like stuck in your throat. And it kind of is. It's stuck there into your trachea until your body can kind of work it back out. All right. Now the trachea passes through, or I should say the air passes through your pharynx, through your larynx, and then down into your trachea, which is the main branch that's going to then go down into the actual lung tissue itself. So here's your trachea. That's going to break off into these major bronchi, which then breaks off just like your blood vessels. Things get smaller and smaller as we go. Same here. So we'll break into individual bronchioles, which will eventually end up at the ends to be these alveoli, which are these little sacs, air sacs, sort of remind me of a bunch of grapes. All right, and that's covered then in capillaries, which is where the actual gas exchange can occur. Something else that's also part of your system, so when you exhale over your vocal cords that are part of your larynx structure, that's how you're able to actually make sounds, so that's also part of this as sort of a secondary function to your respiratory system. Now, when we look at the linings of those major tubes, a lot of them, especially in your larynx and your trachea, those cells are ciliated, meaning that they've got those little hair-like projections. And the idea here is that all of those cilia, if they're functioning properly, should be actually beating up towards your head. So remember we said if you get something kind of stuck in there, you're kind of coughing, you're trying to force its way out. Little stuff can also get caught in those cilia and the mucus that these ciliated cells produce. And the idea is to move all of that mucus back up so that you're not getting additional things, bacteria, viruses, that kind of stuff, down into your lung tissue, which really doesn't have a good mucus way of getting rid of things. But if we can get it up and back into your esophagus, then you can swallow it. It ends up in your stomach, and hopefully the high pH of your stomach acid takes care of it for you. All right, so the actual gas exchange itself is going to take place at these tips, right? So here's a bronchiole, you've got these terminal bronchioles, and then you've got these alveoli, these air sacs here. And they're evolutionarily produced, designed, however you want to use that terminology. The structure, just like anything else, drives its function and vice versa. So I want to be able to increase the surface area as much as possible, and these alveoli, in the way that their structure is, seems to do a really good job of effectively increasing that surface area in your lungs, so that when we look at that gas exchange, so we can make it as efficient as Mother Nature has managed to figure it out at this point. So the oxygen diffuses into these alveoli, and you will have some fluid and things in here to help take care of that. And that gas exchange can then happen across these really thin, moist epithelial cells into those capillaries. The gas exchange will then go the opposite direction with the CO2. So oxygen out of the alveoli into the capillaries, CO2 from capillaries into those alveoli. Now, your alveoli specifically lack cilia, and so are very also, as a result, susceptible to contamination. So you will have things like macrophages that'll hang in here, but that inflammation can also cause fluid buildup in a situation like pneumonia. So these guys are particularly sensitive to that immune response, as well as just infection in general. But they do account for the vast majority of your lungs volume. Remember, we're trying to increase surface area here, and they provide tremendous amounts of it. In fact, you have somewhere on the order of approximately, for an average sized adult, about 300 million of these air sacs in your lung tissue, which is quite incredible in terms of a number. They also make secretions called surfactants. All right, and those surfactants are amphipathic molecules, right? So hydrophilic, hydrophobic regions, and they're going to coat the surface of the alveoli on the inside. So they're going to coat them on the inside here. And what those surfactants are there to do is to help facilitate that gas exchange. Interestingly enough, when we talk about preterm babies, they're preterm and they can struggle breathing because their lung tissue hasn't fully developed yet. And one of the parts of that development that happens really late in pregnancy is their ability for these alveoli to produce that surfactant. And if they aren't at that point yet, their ability to do that gas exchange is really poor. And so they can be very vulnerable to what we call respiratory distress syndrome, where they can't exchange the gases with their environment. So one of the things that they may do, depending on how premature the baby is actually fill their lungs with fluid, which seems counterintuitive to most adults, because water and liquid in your lungs seems like a bad thing. But go back to that fetal development and what they're dealing with while they're in the womb, and they're surrounded by amniotic fluid, and that amniotic fluid is in that lung tissue all the time. So it actually does help